It's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from Behringer-Crawford Museum. Alongside our presenter for this evening, my good friend, Jason French. Also joining me by the powers of Zoom is my assistant for this evening. You're good, Heather. BCM Service Associate Heather Cook. So thank you, Heather and Jason, for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. So let's learn a little bit more about tonight's presenter. Jason French is the Curator of Collections here at Behringer-Crawford Museum, where he has shared Northern Kentucky's rich history since 2017. With a passion for connecting people to the past, he leads the development of engaging exhibits and programs like Curator's Chat. Jason holds a Master's in Public Applied History from Northern Kentucky University and a BSS in Interpretive History from Ohio University. Before joining BCM, he was the coordinator of costume interpretation at the Cincinnati Museum Center. Whether he's digging into archives or sharing little-known local stories, Jason brings history to life with insight and enthusiasm. So thank you so much, Jason, for being here. Now, we do have a few reminders before we get started. We love participation from our viewers, so if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and we will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. Now, the fun part, the quiz question. The first respondent to enter the correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, Simon Kenton told the story of Daniel Boone's 1778 capture to the court of Bracken County. What year did Simon Kenton tell that story? Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jason, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to turn it here, like so, and then we will share our screen. There you go, Jason.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this chat. When Mary Jane asked me if I had a chat, or not a chat, I'm sorry, a history hour, I'm so used to the chats, so bear with me. Tonight is going to be fun for me. This has been something that's been on my mind quite a bit. Next year is America's 250th anniversary. So I've been thinking about what we're going to do in exhibits and kind of planning some of our exhibits, one of which is actually titled Revolution on the Ohio, and really trying to think about how we tell the stories of settlement and conflict in the mid-Ohio Valley where we're at right now. There's so many stories, and also just the aspect of the relationships between Native Americans and settlers, going back as far as at least in the 1750s. Really, in our region, from a Native perspective, there was over 60 years of active conflict. So how do we tell that story as an exhibit? And how do I address it tonight as a presentation with you? And it's been, I've been working on this presentation for a couple of weeks now, and it has been exciting and challenging because there's a lot when you're looking at a 60-year period. So actually tonight I've narrowed it down to really discussing a number of things that I know that we can talk about that happened right here in Northern Kentucky, and also just talking about some of the cultural aspects of settlement and moving west around the time of the Revolutionary War and in our region along the Mid-Ohio Valley. So bear with me. If you've got questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I will do my best to answer them. Some of the specifics, we may have to just see how they get answered in the exhibit next year. But for the time being, we're going to really just try to answer those questions. And I talk about conflict and settlement in northern Kentucky. So, of course, we think about Dr. Walker, Dr. Thomas Walker, and uh, Dr. Walker coming in and exploring, Daniel Boone exploring the Kentucky area, Kentucky as a county or a series of counties for the colony of Virginia. But we're also looking in the Northwest Territory. If we go back as far as Christopher Gist in 1750, he was hired by the Ohio Company to kind of go west with fur traders and kind of meet the natives that were really living in the Ohio country at the time and interact with them and just determine whether or not he felt that the land was settleable, the natives would be agreeable to settlement. And all of this is before we think about the French and Indian War. That journey, he wrote in his journals, it's a very interesting journey. He starts in late December, really is when you start reading his journals. He's traveling through the winter because there's less underbrush. The rivers have got more water in them. And it's just a little easier to travel through the region when it's a little colder, as long as there's not freeze up. So he's some of his early journals, you're reading about staying in a village at Christmas time. And even in that early trip and in that early part of the journal, he talks about a woman who had been a white captive and her escaping and being recaptured and what happened to her. So there's, even early on, there's this constant grinding in the frontier. The folks that are living in the frontier, Native Americans and Europeans, don't really even have the tools to fully understand each other's culture and their religion. So much of the conflict that we have in the 18th century amongst the native peoples and European settlement is just because there's this inability to really understand each other at a base level. There's also, around the time of the French and Indian War, you get so there's not a uniform group of, like, all Europeans aren't thinking the same way and all natives aren't thinking the same way. So there's never a uniform group. Within each little cultural group, linguistic group, there's different ways to interact with each other. You see that within the French and Indian War a great deal. Different natives ally with the French than the ones that ally with the English. And they're all playing each other against the others to try to really work for the strongest and best outcome for their own group, their own cultural group. So there's all of this interesting migration, and throughout the country within native groups, there's conflict within native groups, and you see all of this kind of panning out and happening along the Ohio Valley in the 1750s. There's major conflicts with, you start getting George Washington coming up as a young officer. You're getting other interactions, Braddock's defeat. By the 1760s, you're having, under like the time of Pontiac's rebellion, you get all of these other kind of interesting things happening, like the Shawnee are moving up from where they had been in the South and wanting to really settle in Ohio proper, what we would now call Ohio, up the Scioto. They had a village in the time that Christopher Gist was coming through in 1750. There was a large village that was on both sides of the Ohio River at the mouth of the Scioto and what now would be Portsmouth as we think about it. But that was a relatively recent village site. By 1760, there was a battle that's very little understood. And I'm hoping to actually get into maybe some British records and some fur trade records to help us understand it better. But there was a battle between native groups, between the people that we call the Miami and the Shawnee in Bellevue, Kentucky, in that early 1760s period. That battle itself allowed the outcome of that battle. The Shawnee were victorious in that battle. That outcome allowed them to move into the central part of what we think of as the state of Ohio, up the Scioto, places like Chillicothe and other places. And they ended up being a pretty crucial buffer between the folks that we think of as the Miami and other blocks of natives that were being pushed further and further west by the Iroquois Confederation. So all of that's happening, and different people are trying to access trade rights and the conflict between the French trade goods and the English trade goods, who can offer the better trade goods, how much they can get, and all of that is in the background of those very first settlers that are coming across the Appalachian Ridge. They're either coming down the Ohio or they're coming through the Cumberland Gap or some of the other gaps in the ridge line and starting to trickle into Kentucky, which had been for a while kind of a shared hunting ground with most of the natives that we think about in the period that we're really aware of. There had been native villages in the times of the mound builders, and maybe even in the 16th century, we're going to have native villages in the region. But because of really the apocalyptic everything that had happened because of the Spanish bringing disease into North America really changed native perspective and a lot of the native understanding. Just so many people had died. They're lost so many villages and a lot of their culture. They were, by the time that you've got guys like LaSalle in the 16th century or the 17th century, the 1680s, coming down the Ohio, most of those villages, they were all gone. So by Gist time in 1750 or so, you're starting to see a settlement from a native perspective into the lands along the Ohio. And so those lands are a little contested. And as Europeans start moving in, you've got all of this conflict between them. Most of the natives probably didn't care if there was a little fur trade outpost or a small home here or there. But it's when you start seeing large migration coming across, groups of hundreds across the ridge, that it started really being a problem from a native perspective. They're competing for hunting, they're competing for land rights. And after the outcome of the French and Indian War, the English became victorious. The English had more industrial base so that they could create better fur trade items or could give more of them than the French had. So the English tended to be victorious from a native perspective. Um, all of this is the background of early settlement into Kentucky. And we're starting to have uh, those interactions. So when you look at before the Revolutionary War, you've got a conflict called Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. There's this Lord Dunmore was the governor of Virginia, and there's the natives are really upset with some of the settlement. There's a lot of kind of border strife and conflict. People are being attacked on both sides. And Dunmore was going to have a treaty with the natives. So in 1774, he gathers his people, he crosses into Ohio, um, and he kind of goes ahead of the militia, and he goes up to an area we now think of as Circleville, Ohio. There was a large elm tree there. There was always a meeting place. And at that large elm, he starts creating a treaty with the Shawnee and other native Ohio groups. Well, while that's happening, at the mouth of the Kanawha River on the Ohio, which would now be Point Pleasant, West Virginia, Blue Jacket and other natives have engaged in a fight with the frontier militia at a place that is called the Battle of Point Pleasant. So even then, before the Revolutionary War, at the end of that, the settlers felt that they had been betrayed by their governor. This battle had happened. The natives some natives are signing a treaty while other natives are engaged in a battle. So there is very much a contested aspect of the Ohio Valley. It is the Ohio River is this highway of commerce even then. It wouldn't have been uncommon to see in the fur trade era dugout canoes made from giant tulip poplar logs that would be 40 or 60 feet long, and they're maybe 4 feet or 5 feet wide, just packed full of trade goods. And even though we think about trade goods from a post-European perspective, if you go back 1,000 years, you're going to see something very similar with those same styles of large dugout canoes bringing trade goods from the west or up the Mississippi from a native perspective. So this river was always an important thoroughfare, and not a lot had changed for a long time. It's just the people that were in the area was changing in this migration throughout the lands. So it's always kind of contested. And you had these fragile alliances. Oh, by the way, I meant to say this earlier. All of these wonderful paintings that I've got in the background, they're really from two very talented frontier artists. One is a gentleman from Maysville, Kentucky, who painted this painting some years back, named Steve White. And the other artist is David Wright. So one of the things that I'm excited about and hope to fully see as the exhibit develops for next year is we'll actually be borrowing paintings from at least Steve White, and I'm hoping David Wright as well for the exhibit. So as you see these wonderful scenes, it's just something I wanted to share with you. I'm very glad that there were these artists that spent a lot of time researching the time period and worked very hard to reproduce scenes. So the idea of these fragile alliances, alliances amongst the natives are often, you've got linguistic groups, Algonquin speaking and Iroquoian speaking groups. And then also within natives is always talking about the French or the English. And there's always this kind of fragile alliance where people are working for their own group's benefit. And you see that a lot. And when we look at, say, the French and Indian War, we've often oversimplified it as that the natives didn't necessarily have their own, that they were being used by either side, but it was really natives, the French, and the English were all using each other. And that didn't really change a lot after the French and Indian War. You just had the French were out of the picture, but the English and the natives, and then we think about colonists and settlers. And there's a lot of this just fragile alliances, treaties. You know, you try to make a treaty, but if the treaty is signed by the elders in a tribe, but the young men don't want to honor it, or the treaty was signed by the Lenape or the Delaware, and maybe it was signed by the Wyandotte and the Miami, but the Shawnee didn't want to honor it, or the Seneca did not want to honor it, or the Mingo. We think about John Logan, Chief Logan, who his family had been attacked and brutally murdered along the Ohio River. And he was a chief of a group called the Mingo. So he went on a vendetta raid as far in to Tennessee and attacked and killed people, even though he had been traditionally very friendly with whites and European settlement. Because his family was killed, he went and killed in vengeance. And after the fact, he went back to that same elm tree that is in now that was in Circleville, Ohio, that Lord Dunmore signed his treaty after Dunmore's War. That same massive elm that stood there for hundreds, if not close to 1,000 years. And Logan gave a very powerful speech, talking about that he was the last of his family group and that there was no one left to mourn for him. But he was laying down his tomahawk at that point. He had gotten the vengeance that he needed to get. So there's so much of these stories, those alliances where they could very easily be broken. And once one group or the other lashes out at settlers or settlers lash out at natives, those treaties were meaningless. And you through that 60-year period, it was such a difficult there was so much difficulty to have any lasting peace. because of that. We think about the Revolutionary War. So Lord Dunmore's war was 1774, and the revolution breaks out on the East Coast. So how does that differ in the frontier? There's a lot that happens out here in the frontier. Right here, there's a couple of incidences. Let's talk a little bit about 1778. So, this is the year after the year of the Bloody Sevens. But early in 1778, Daniel Boone has left Boonesboro with a group of men. He is going to lower Blue Licks on the Licking River to make salt. When he's out making salt, his group gets completely ambushed. He is captured. He ends up being captured by the Shawnee, lives with the Shawnee for several months, adopted into the tribe, and he's slowly kind of finding his way to. Boone is a good survivor. So he is slowly trying to work his way, collect a few things so that he can make his escape. So after Boone escapes, he comes back to Kentucky. He gets back to Boonesboro. It was a challenge for Kentuckians because the other men were murdered. They were all killed. He's the one that escapes. He comes back to them when he was adopted into the tribe. Really being adopted into the tribe means you start practicing the native religion often. And they make you look like a native. So it's entirely plausible as Boone comes back, his hair had been plucked. He may have only had a scalp lock on the top of his head. And he would have looked more like a native than he had when he left. So there was this great distrust amongst the folks at Boonesboro. But he gets back, and he's just back just in time for there's a siege at Boonesboro. So the siege at Boonesboro, it's I think around September of 1778. And there's a number of days and there's where they're besieged by Simon Girty and a group of a couple hundred or more Native Americans. Boone is wounded. His leg is broken. There's a story of Simon Kenton actually running out and picking him up and carrying him back into the fort and saving his life. At a point in the siege, the natives decide to give up the siege. They don't have any way to break the stockade. They have no way to get in, and they're starting to take losses. So they leave the siege. It was about 12 days, if I remember correctly. And they leave. So what we find when we look at Northern Kentucky history is really for prehistory and recorded history. In our region, the way that people got into the interior of Ohio or the interior of Kentucky from the Ohio River was up or down the Licking River. So the native group was going to head right back up the Licking to the mouth of the Licking at the Ohio. And what has also happened in 1778 is earlier in that year, the governor of Virginia had hired a man, an officer, Colonel David Rogers, to pick up keelboats around Pittsburgh and take them down to New Orleans and buy gunpowder and supplies for the Continental Army and the Virginians to fight the Revolution. Rogers goes down to New Orleans, is on his way back up, had a brief stop at the fort at the Falls of the Ohio at Louisville, picks up a third keelboat, and they're convoying up. His men are exhausted. They've did this all in a relatively short period of time, and certainly coming up against the stream, they are pushing with poles and just pushing their way up against the current. And we're looking, it's slowly, it's like September, so the water level is pretty low. There's probably a fair amount of struggling with dragging the boats and other things. They come up to the records that I have read, and this is a contested, a little bit of contested story, because the old historians from the 1880s and others say that this event happened in a slightly different place. But what I've been reading from records from Colonel David Rogers' widows, her trying to get land grants that would have been for her husband after the Revolutionary War in Kentucky. So there's all of this petition for land to pay for her late husband's service. Well, Rogers and his men come up to, says, before the mouth of the Licking, and they see a small group of natives on the bank. They, have about 60 men in the 3 or so keelboats. They decide to pull the keelboats in, and if there's natives on the bank, if they leave them there, they know that those natives are going to be going into some little stockade or fort in Kentucky, and somebody's going to be attacked. So they're like, well, we need to stop and try to protect the settlers in Kentucky. They unload their keelboats with the troops. The men march up out of the river basin, kind of up the hill, out of the floodplain. And what they find out is there were over 200 natives there, according to the records, which is around the same number that had been at Boonesboro. So it's entirely plausible. This is another thing that I really need to get into the Loyalist records in Canada to fully prove my thoughts on it. But those men, that 60 men, got massacred. Just a handful of them survived. Rogers was I believe, gut shot and tried to escape, but never did. There was a man that was trying to help him. He did escape and found his way back down to Louisville. Rogers' defeat is a Revolutionary War battle that happened right here in northern Kentucky. Now, when you look it up, often it will say it happened in Dayton, Kentucky. But it always says near the mouth of the Licking. The records that I'm seeing from the Virginia records, it says before the mouth of the Licking. And it's still near the mouth of the Licking. So sometimes I kind of, well, Dayton, Kentucky's a little further away, but these are battles. I suspect that what happened is Boonesboro siege was not successful. The whole group of natives come back up the Licking, and they just happened to run into 3 keelboats, which they were actually able to take 2 of the keelboats and those supplies. So that is a significant win for the Native Americans and the British that happened right here in northern Kentucky during the Revolution. So I find that a really interesting story. And we look at, there are others. There's constant. So Rogers' defeat happens within a few years. The Americans get the upper hand when Colonel David Rogers' cousin, um, uh, George Rogers Clark, marches his men to Vincennes through a swamp, and they take the British commanding officer and that whole British garrison. They take them all prisoner. And George Rogers Clark was very much known as um, a native fighter. So when we look at the next event that happened in northern Kentucky that I want to talk about, when we look at Byrd and his invasion of Kentucky, this is a story that would have happened completely differently had George Rogers Clark not lived, as we sometimes say, rent free in the native mind. So Hamilton had been captured by George Rogers Clark. The British High Command in the West had to be replaced. The new commanding officer was a man named DePester. DePester was in Detroit. It's 1780. Everybody knows there has to be some kind of standoff, this big battle in the West along the Ohio to fully realize what the British goals are and what the American goals are. So the thought was, to win this battle, the British needed to do something that no one had done before. And what you don't really see at that time in the Ohio Valley is they needed to bring cannons to the battle. So DePester told Byrd that Byrd had been really working with natives, living in a village, and kind of being a liaison from the British Army and the Native Americans and working with fur trade and all. But Byrd becomes, I believe they make him a colonel, and they have this battle plan that the goal is to bring George Rogers Clark to a pitched battle somewhere along the Ohio Valley, maybe at the falls of the Ohio, maybe somewhere else in Kentucky. They need to bring him to battle. So they start making this plan. They get a bateau, which is a flat bottom boat. They put 3 cannons on it, 2 swivel guns, which would have been 3-pounders as they describe them, and 1 6-pound field piece. Probably all 3 pieces were bronze. British cannons tended to be bronze. They get these cannons. They get a whole flotilla of birch bark lake canoes and natives, and they start paddling down from Detroit into Lake Erie. They take their flotilla of growing troops. There's several hundred British troops. And by the time that it gets their trip really makes it to the Ohio River, there's probably 1,000 or so natives. Certainly Simon Girty, the frontier renegade is often described. He was part of it as well. So they actually, they float down from Detroit, they cross the Lake Erie, and they start paddling upstream the Maumee. So all the way into kind of the interior of what we think of as Ohio. And there was a ford point, a portage, more than a ford. There was a portage point that must have existed for maybe thousands of years, where the Maumee River and the Great Miami River were about 20 miles apart. So they took all of those boats, those canoes, the cannons, the bateau, and they carried it that 20 miles from the Maumee to the Great Miami River. And they put those boats and canoes in the Great Miami, and they started floating towards the Ohio. They got to the mouth of the Ohio, and they sat there for a while because Byrd was waiting for some Shawnee chiefs to join his army. And they were waiting and waiting in the meantime, because they knew that George Rogers Clark knew that there had to be something that was going to happen. So they had scouts and people out, and they were waiting because Clark was at the fort at the Falls of the Ohio at Louisville. And they were waiting to see what Clark would do. Well, it just so happened, for whatever reason, George Rogers Clark, this is around March or so of 1780, George Rogers Clark decides to take his troops down the Ohio to where the Ohio joins the Mississippi, goes about 12 miles south of the mouth of the Ohio, and builds a fort down there, leaves Louisville undefended, and the Falls of the Ohio undefended. At that point in time, the British and Byrd had a great deal of desire to go downstream and take the falls and the fort at Louisville, and then they could invade into Kentucky at their leisure. At that point in time, they would have that stronghold. The natives that consisted most of the largest portion of the army, they, once again, George Rogers Clark, for whatever reason, was living rent-free in their brains. They thought it was a trap. They were convinced that if they get down there, George Rogers Clark is going to come and they're going to all lose. So the consensus, once the Shawnee show up, the consensus was, okay, we're still going to raid into Kentucky, but we're not going to go to Louisville. Instead, from the mouth of the Great Miami River, they paddled against the current again to the mouth of the Licking. They took all of that flotilla up the Licking River to the forks of the Licking, which would be now Falmouth, Kentucky. They unloaded all of their troops, the cannons, all there, and they marched towards a place called Ruddle's Station. Ruddle's Station would be roughly around Cynthiana, Kentucky now. As that native army and British army gets close to Ruddle's Station, they do have one of those cannons kind of forward enough. They lose the element of surprise, but the folks at Ruddle's go inside, they're ready to defend their station as they always have. They've until the British started firing the cannon. The 3-pound cannon they fired, they got 2 shots in. And after that second shot, the Americans, the folks that were the Kentuckians that were living at Ruddle Station, their stockade wall had started to splinter. They knew they could not withstand a bombardment of multiple cannons. So they decided to surrender. Byrd had promised that there wasn't going to be any looting or people weren't going to die. So they surrender. The that whole promise was not able. He was not able to keep that. There was some looting. Some people died. Sometimes it's called a massacre. But after that, because about 15 miles away is another stockade, another little place called Martin's Station. So then the British start heading towards Martin's Station. Martins had heard what had happened at Ruddle Station, and they were horrified, and they knew they couldn't withstand a bombardment from cannons. So they surrender as well. So now Byrd has a new problem. He's in Kentucky, and he now has about 450 prisoners, right around that number. So what does he do? He starts marching them back to the Licking River, and along that west bank of the Licking and up towards the Ohio with all those canoes. And at that point, that raid, he had captured 450 or so Kentuckians. Those Kentuckians were taken from there. Certain natives got different prisoners, and kind of the people, because Byrd could not feed all of those people. So he started kind of letting different native groups keep different prisoners in hopes that they could be fed at that point. So I have a timer. So
We are getting a little closer. We're at
We're-
7:18.
we're at 7:18. I've got to hurry. Okay. The moral of that story, or what I was trying to get to, as I've been a little more long-winded than I wanted, was that one incident that happened, that those people were brought through northern Kentucky. They were Kentuckians. That was 1/10 of the population of Kentucky was taken out of Kentucky at the time of that invasion. So after that, that's 1780. Within a few years, you've got Yorktown, you've got treaties, the end of the Revolutionary War. So now we've got settlement, right? It's wide open, we've got settlement. Or do we? So we've got people starting to come in, build little stockades, and settle, especially after the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. We start getting settlement in Lasantaville, which is across the river from the Licking River. That was in October of 1788. You get people settling at the Europeans, at least, at the mouth of the Little Miami, in Columbia. That's Benjamin Stites and Spencers and others settling there. You had Kentuckians with Matthias Denman, Colonel Robert Patterson, and a man named John Filson, who were the ones that really, with John Cleve Sims, started that initial survey of the lands between the Miami rivers into Ohio. Well, even that original survey in September of 1788, not all of those men came home. John Filson who was their surveyor and is the man that made Daniel Boone famous when he wrote a book about Colonel Boone. That really, and we've got the Filson Society. Well, that September, at some point in time between those Miami rivers, somewhere up there, John Filson was killed. And if you listen to Colonel Robert Patterson, Matthias Denman, and John Cleve Sims, well, their stories don't always add up, but they'll say that he was killed by a single Indian, but they never found his body. So even in the 1789, 1778, I'm sorry, not 78, 88, I'm losing track of my dates. 1788, there's still conflict. The treaties didn't really matter in the West. The British never gave up their forts along Lake Erie. They didn't give up Detroit. So they're still trading with the natives, and the fight is still continuing. And we see that fight continuing in the Ohio Valley. 1789 or so, Josiah Harmer comes right across the mouth right across from the mouth of the Licking and builds a little fort called Fort Washington. It was built from old flatboats. It enclosed about 40,000 square feet. Harmer builds Fort Washington. 1790, Harmer's 1st American Regiment has a battle with the Shawnee and the Miami, Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, and others. And Harmer's army, the United States, the new United States of America army, defeated, beat bad by the natives. So Harmer, he can't do this. Must be a new general, somebody to take control. Arthur St. Clair. St. Clair was the territorial governor of the whole Northwest Territory. Built himself a fancy brick mansion in what is now downtown Cincinnati near 8th and Main Street. He's going to lead the troops. Harmer couldn't do it, but St. Clair could. 1791. Arthur St. Clair marches into Ohio with all those troops, raring to have a fight. Well, what happens? Well, Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, and others, they beat him so bad, they call it the Battle of 1,000 Slain. And what we find is that, for whatever reason, historians will say that that was the worst defeat of the United States Army at the hands of a foreign enemy until we lost at Bataan in the Second World War. Well, it's going to take another officer, it's going to take another general to maybe settle some of this conflict, all of that that's going on. Because in the meantime, 1791, it was the 7th of July, 1791, that one of those Spencers, a little young, a 10-year-old boy named Oliver Spencer, he and his sisters had came to Fort Washington for the 4th of July. They were going to see the troops march. They were going to see the cannons fire. The sisters were all excited because there was going to be a ball and there was going to be dancing with soldiers. Well, 10-year-old Oliver, he didn't care. He just wanted to see the guns and see the cannons fire. But he gets bored with it by the 7th of July. He's going to take a canoe with a very drunk guy and a lady and another man back to the mouth of the Little Miami, where his folks live. But the drunk guy's bothering him, so he marches along. He's walking along the bank. They're about a mile away from Fort Washington, east around just underneath what we now call Mount Adams. He's captured by a Wyandot and a Shawnee warrior, and he ends up in captivity for something like 11 months. In his captivity, he was ultimately adopted by the Wyandot. But in his captivity, he got to meet Blue Jacket. As his family finally bought his freedom through the fur traders, he goes up and he meets the commanding officer at Detroit. They send him across Lake Erie, which is a fun little story in his narrative too. But once he gets across Lake Erie, finally, he goes back east. He meets President George Washington, who's asking him about the British troops, this and the natives and all of their forces, because the English have not given up their hold in the West. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the natives? Mad Anthony Wayne's how you do it. Anthony Wayne is sent to Fort Washington and he starts drilling the troops. And he moves the troops out of Fort Washington because Cincinnati's getting a little too full of people and they're getting distracted. Moves them up to a place called Hobson's Choice. He does a number of things to work on their readiness. He makes sure he does some tricky little things that allows them to fire quicker. He brings he has certain small howitzer cannons that are packable. And by 1793, he's marched into Ohio, fights a battle called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, wins, definitively, finally wins against the natives. And then he immediately starts sending out the idea for treaty. That treaty happens in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville. And that treaty is a very uneasy peace. But that peace lasts for almost 15 years before you start having some guy named Tecumseh. And Tecumseh starts moving into prominence, he and his brother, and people are really frightened. There's been this constant conflict on both sides. The natives are getting pressure. They've lost lands. They're losing their identity. You're starting to get whole states. But Kentucky's been made a state. Ohio's been made a state. There's all of these areas that are becoming states that had been native land. Everything's in contention. And that's as Tecumseh starts rising into power. The British, of course, all along are still trading and keeping natives supplied with red paint, tomahawks, scalping knives, guns, gunpowder, because they are really wanting to maybe take back what they had lost. Fort Washington is moved to Newport, to the Newport Barracks. The War of 1812 starts, and I'm rushing through this, I'm sorry. War of 1812, most Kentuckians going off to the War of 1812, they come through Newport. So many of them ended up at these battles like the River Rays in the Thames. There were a lot of Kentuckians who actually ended up fighting at the Battle of Lake Erie on the ships with Commodore Perry. So there's all of these wonderful stories of Kentuckians that would have mustered out of Newport. The Battle of the Thames was a decisive American victory. Tecumseh is killed, and it's only a little while longer. That was in 1813. That we start the end of the war, and really kind of the end of that period by 1814 or so of conflict. Something that I think I forgot to mention, as we talked about back in 1778, and Daniel Boone's captivity. Daniel Boone's captivity is interesting for us because we do have this wonderful historic document here at Behringer-Crawford Museum that was a court deposition from Simon Kenton. And he was asked by the courts in Bracken County to tell that story. But once again, Kentuckians didn't trust Boone, and there was a lot of land disputes over Boone. But it was all the way in 1814 that Simon Kenton is being deposed about when Daniel Boone was captured by the natives in 1778. So all of this is all intertwined, all these stories. And I'm excited because hopefully you've enjoyed this, and I'm really excited to really put this together in an exhibit next year where we can really explore that interaction along the Ohio with Kentuckians and natives and settlement, the French, the English, everybody involved. I hope you've enjoyed this. Has anybody got questions?
Thank you, Jason. Well, that was a little bit of a hint there for the trivia. Miss Heather, are you there? Did we have, let's go ahead and first repeat that trivia question, and then you can let us know if we had a winner.
So that was Simon Kenton told the story of Daniel Boone's 1778 capture to the court of Bracken County. What year did he tell that story? We have not had a winner. We haven't had very many guesses either. So if somebody wants to try to guess real quick before we wrap up.
I kind of forgot to tell you earlier. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. No, I mean, it's all right. Maybe this will be our first one where we don't have a trivia winner. Because Jason, you actually just told us the answer. Go ahead and repeat that answer.
Did. So that Bracken County deposition where Simon Kenton tells the story of when Daniel Boone was captured was in 1814.
Who was closest? Let's go with that one. Who was the closest? Do we have somebody really close? Or even just the closest?
Brent Kelch on Facebook was the closest with
Good
1806.
job, Brent. Let's go with Brent.
All
Congratulations, Brent. You were the closest, so good job. Thank you, Jason, for the great presentation. Do we have any questions?
Well, so our one question was, why did that story get told to the court? And Jason also just answered that right at the end there. And then the only other question we had was, what does your shirt have to do with tonight's presentation?
I'm wearing a tie. I just wanted to look fancy.
Jason is always known for his very creative shirts that he wears here at the museum. So yeah. He dressed up for the occasion. Any other questions?
We have not had any other questions.
I do want to point out that we've got some comments, like they'd love to hear more in-depth presentation on Fort Boonesborough. And then also, let's see, and thanking you. So thank you again for the great presentation, Jason. And we look forward to learning more about it in a wonderful exhibit here at Behringer-Crawford Museum. So yeah, a very interesting summary. Great job. So great job, Jason. So thank you so much. So we are a little over time. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap up really quickly and tell you a little bit more about what's going on here at the museum. So Heather, get our slides up and we'll close this with our year-long celebration is continuing still. It's our 75th anniversary. So we're celebrating the legacy of Behringer-Crawford Museum, 75 years of art, culture, and community. Each floor of the museum has been transformed. So I invite everyone to come and visit and rediscover the museum. Music at BCM returns this Thursday evening with our final concert for the summer, and it's a good one. We have Ben Levin, Ricky Nye, and Noah Wotherspoon with blues and R&B to close us out. Food will be available for purchase from Taste on Elm, so bring your lawn chairs and get ready for another great night at BCM. For more details, visit bcmuseum.org. There are still tickets available for purchase for our 75th anniversary wine raffle. For just $5, you get a chance at winning this wine-filled basket pictured here with over $250 worth of contents. Purchase your tickets at the museum front desk, and the winner will be drawn on September 6th. And speaking of September 6th, that's a very big day at the museum because that is our 33rd annual Fresh Art Party and Art Auction. Far more than just an art auction, Fresh Art is a celebration of creativity, community, and purpose that brings together local artists, art lovers, and good friends for a good cause. Tickets are just a $60 donation and can be purchased on our website at bcmuseum.org, or you can call the museum at 859-491-4003. Can't make it to the Fresh Art event? You can still bid on silent artworks online beginning August 14th at 6 p.m. The link will be on our website very soon. Our next Northern Kentucky History Hour will be on August 26th with BCM archaeologist Janine Crimebrink. She will be presenting on the history of archaeology in the U.S., so please tune in for that. If you have a topic that you would like to see on the program, please email Mary Jane at communications@bcmuseum.org. I would love to hear your ideas. For more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where you can find the latest Curators Chat, along with all of our past Northern Kentucky History Hour presentations. Please like and subscribe. That's all that we have time for this evening, so thank you again to all of our sponsors and supporters of BCM. Until next time, everyone, take care and good night. Thank you all.